wow, what are the chances that the impartial rule of law would keep hitting with such remarkable partiality? One might think that maybe Lady Justice is peeking just a little bit under the blindfold because prosecutors federally and in New York and in Georgia are now an impeccable 4 for 4 and maybe even counting in bringing charges against Trump. This after Fulton County District Attorney Fannie Willis in Atlanta secured an indictment from a grand jury on Monday night, not just against Trump, but 18 other people in apparently the greatest racketeering scheme since Al Capone, an illegal plot to overturn Georgia's 2020 election results. And of course, not just the indictment, but its unveiling was a clown show for a list of reasons almost as long as the indictment itself. The fact that it leaked online hours beforehand, maybe it was that same pesky burst pipe in Atlanta that caused so many other leaky problems in the freest, fairest, most secure election of all time. Whatever happened, your guess is as good as my guess is as good as her guess because the district attorney has no idea.
I am not an expert on clerks' duties or even administrative duties. I wouldn't know how to work that system, and so I'm not going to speculate.
Well, hey, good to know that the prosecutor is not an expert on the court system. My mistake for thinking maybe the plumber was an expert on leaky pipes. She knows nothing about how courts work, but she does know everything about the proper application of RICO charges. And hey, it's not just me questioning her expertise. The court itself did that implicitly, labeling the leaked indictment fictitious on Monday, until just hours later when it suddenly transformed into very legitimate official prosecutor documentation. Well, even if the document was fictitious, which it clearly was not, the question remains, how did fiction mysteriously invade your official government website? Regardless, it's not just that. It's the timing of the case to consider too. The last supposed criminal act of Donald Trump, or at least act in pursuit of the crime, if you want to be technical and specific, Trump's last act described in the indictment happened in September 2021. A Trump statement to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger that Trump believed the number of false or irregular votes in Georgia is greater than needed to change the Georgia election result. And for some reason, it took almost 2 years after that event to research and gather all of this information, all the rest of which happened beforehand, and all of this very conveniently lining up with the rest of this pre-election parade of other charges. With all of those absurd circumstances surrounding the case, it's tough to take the substance of the case seriously. Tougher still when the substance doesn't take itself seriously. As was thoroughly mocked on Twitter upon the indictment's release, it includes in its long list of overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, as they're characterized, alleged criminal adjacent things like requesting phone numbers, reserving conference rooms, Trump tweeting that people should watch the Georgia hearing on potential election fraud, and requesting attendance at government hearings. The idea being that if the mafia meets at McDonald's to discuss their upcoming hit, well, then the lunch at McDonald's is transformed into some quasi-criminal act. Oh, but that's not the worst stuff. Correct, it isn't. There are claims of actual crime in the indictment, not just tweet crime, things like the supposed forgery related to alternate electors, even though that has historical precedent, or Sidney Powell supposedly gaining illegal access to vote data in Coffee County with the help of a county election official, or the claim of perjury. The DA says one of the lawyers involved lied to the grand jury during investigation. But a few things about the more serious components, when you muddle them with tweet crime or conference room reservation crime, they are much less focused, and intent comes into question. Are you targeting serious breaches of the law, or are you just grasping for whatever straws that you can? And to that intent question, you can see why this indictment reads like such a mess of nonsense, with some things seemingly serious and others becoming immediate and obvious jokes. But there is a method to the madness. It's because of the legal theory in this case, racketeering. It's all one big organized criminal enterprise. So yeah, they may not have Trump on things we would ordinarily think of as crimes, things like phone calls or tweets, But they think they have others on crimes, and through the speech crime, they can tie Trump to the organization. And if they can tie Trump to the organization, well, then they have their prized racketeering charge. So the serious allegations against others exist only insofar as they're a pathway to get Trump under this statute and legal theory. But rather than painfully analyze 161 overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy, the overwhelming majority of which are just people talking about their opinions and possible strategies available through legal pathways, not in violation of them, there is an important distinction that is much more crucial to consider. The consequences for conviction in Georgia are much higher than any other case that Trump faces. In New York, in the Stormy Daniels hush money case, the charges are flimsy because they rely on attaching Trump's supposedly improper payments to a federal campaign finance felony that was never prosecuted anyway. And even if that untested and likely bogus legal theory holds, there's a maximum 4-year prison sentence that is highly unlikely to be imposed anyway. That case is going nowhere. The federal cases for classified document retention at Mar-a-Lago and attempting to delay or stop the election certification on January 6th, those do carry hefty potential prison sentences that are unlikely to be imposed, but crucially, as federal crimes, they are pardonable by the president. So were Trump to get elected, they are theoretically pardonable by himself. Get sworn in, pardon yourself, walk out, and call it a great first day back in office. And that's if Trump were even imprisoned on these charges in the first place, which is a big if, considering even a conviction in these cases doesn't necessarily require it. This Georgia case, though, even if it reads like a joke, has extremely serious danger for Trump, and by extension, I think for the stability of the country. Because unlike these other cases that are prison possible and pardonable, this one is prison mandatory with no path to pardon at all. This Georgia racketeering law is modeled after the federal one, except in Georgia, it's even stiffer. Conviction under this law carries a mandatory 5-year prison sentence minimum. I'm not a Georgia lawyer, of course. Perhaps there's some technical way around that. I do see that Georgia has a first offender law, for example, that offers leniency for first offenders, but that's at a judge's sole discretion to even offer it. And it's available only if the first offender acknowledges guilt. Trump is not going to do that.
Is there any chance you take a plea deal in Georgia?
We did nothing wrong. We don't ever take a plea deal. Yes, sir. We don't take plea deals. It's a wise guy question.
Okay, so let's assume Trump fights it and gets convicted, which looks like the trajectory here. That's a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. But hey, the governor could still let him out, right? Sure, Brian Kemp and Trump have had their disputes and disagreements, but the Republican governor would put that aside to stop this nonsense, right? You would think, but no, he can't. Of course, the president can't pardon for state convictions, but in Georgia, even the governor can't do it. In fact, Georgia is one of the strictest states on pardons in the country. Georgia is one of only 6 states in which the governor holds no pardon power. Only the State Board of Pardons and Paroles can do it. Okay, but those board members are appointed by the governor, so couldn't the board just pardon Trump? No, actually. Not even they can do it, at least immediately. By Georgia law, they can't even consider a pardon until 5 years after a sentence is completed. So if Trump gets convicted in this case and sentenced to prison, as is mandatory, he will be there for at least 5 years, and then it will be 5 more until that felony is even eligible to be excused. It is highly likely that Trump won't even be around to see that legal possibility. And so now we can see why Georgia was selected. It's strange to look through the indictment and see allegations of criminal operation in other states, Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and more. Why are these relevant in Georgia? And if they are, why not prosecute under existing federal RICO law? Because the federal law doesn't carry the mandatory prison sentence, and a federal conviction would be pardonable. And so by prosecuting in Georgia, they bring the highest chance of locking Trump up and throwing away the key, with hardly a damn thing anybody can do about it. And I say hardly there deliberately, because it's not quite a zero prospect at release if this scenario plays out. Perhaps the Georgia legislature could revise pardon rules. Of course, the Georgia courts could intervene if there was some violation of law or process. Even the Supreme Court could intervene if Trump's constitutional rights were violated. But imagine the political instability that such a scenario would create. Either Trump sits unreleasable in prison, and half the country sees that as the lawfare that I personally think that it is, weaponizing the legal system to deny a fair election process, or the Supreme Court intervenes and gets Trump out, and the other half of the country views that as corrupt because, of course, Trump picked a third of those justices. Either path leads to massive political chaos, and one side viewing the other as abusing the system. And both of those scenarios assume Trump would willingly surrender to a prison sentence in the first place, which itself is a big if. If Trump actually was sentenced to prison, I'm not sure that he would do that. And I'm not sure that he'd be alone in his refusal to comply either. I could see a situation in which a state or somebody else gives Trump legal refuge. Maybe Ron and Don get the band back together to fortify the old bunker down in Florida. And then you will have the spectacle of a sitting president sending feds to arrest his fugitive opposition and whatever resistance that may face, with still the comical insistence that this is all just the rule of law at work, and not the final deterioration of it into absolute chaos. The great irony is there is actually a criminal enterprise at work here, of course. There is actually a national conspiracy. It's just not the one alleged by the overt acts described in this indictment. How could anyone conclude anything but the coordination in play here when all of these criminal cases drop neatly in a 4-month sequence, even though the crimes alleged in the first case date back 8+ years? How did all of these supposedly independent prosecutors in different jurisdictions suddenly get in line with perfectly coincidental timing, if not planned organization? They didn't. It is organized. They actually are committing overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. The conspiracy to deny Donald Trump his right to speak, among others, and the conspiracy to deny us an actually free and fair choice in the next election without their undue interference. But maybe I shouldn't be so pessimistic. Maybe I should look forward to this exciting new future in which politicians lying in pursuit of their agendas is now a jailable offense, because after all, we have a lot of lies to prosecute. I'm not sure there's even one innocent campaign. So if this creates a future in which all of these people rot in prison, well, maybe that's not so bad after all. But of course, it won't, because that's not the way this works. That's the thing about lawfare. It's not a question of what crimes are punished. It's a question of whose crimes are punished. Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime, a famous commie once said. But skip ahead a few years and see how that philosophy eventually claimed him, too. Later, he became the man, and they found the crime, and then his forehead found a bullet as he pleaded otherwise. And I'm not endorsing that, YouTube community guidelines compliance officers. I'm just noting historical precedent. So far, I don't think history lessons are overt acts in furtherance of the conspiracy. Not yet, at least. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds, that is at ML Christensen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.